In this episode, we're going to focus on authorization, which is the part of access control that decides what an authenticated identity is allowed to do. And we're going to make it concrete by exploring entitlements, groups, roles, and access reviews as the building blocks of safer decisions. Beginners often understand authentication first because it feels obvious. You prove who you are, but then they assume authorization is automatic or simple, as if the system just knows what you should be able to do. In reality, authorization is where most real-world risk hides, because authorization is about power, scope, and boundaries, and small mistakes can expose large amounts of data or enable high-impact actions. Authorization also tends to get messy over time as organizations change and permissions accumulate, which means the system's decisions drift away from the original design. The goal here is to help you understand how authorization is structured, why it fails, and how to make it safer through disciplined design and ongoing review. Entitlements are the most basic unit of authorization, and a beginner-friendly way to define an entitlement is a specific permission to perform a specific action on a specific resource or class of resources. For example, an entitlement might allow reading a certain dataset, approving a certain type of request, or administering a certain system function. Entitlements matter because they are what the system enforces at the moment of decision. When you click a button, request a file, or attempt an administrative action, the system checks whether your identity, through whatever access structure you have, includes the necessary entitlements. Beginners sometimes imagine entitlements as abstract, but they are the actual rule fragments that determine access outcomes. The more fine-grained the entitlements, the more precisely you can limit authority, but the more complicated management becomes. The more coarse the entitlements, the easier management becomes, but the greater the risk that users receive access beyond what they truly need. Safer authorization begins with being intentional about what entitlements exist and how they are grouped. Groups are one of the most common ways systems manage entitlements at scale because assigning entitlements directly to every user creates chaos. A group is a collection of identities that are treated similarly for access purposes, and groups can be used to attach entitlements once and then grant them to many users by membership. Groups can represent teams, departments, projects, or functional categories, and they are appealing because they reduce the effort of managing permissions individually. The danger is that groups can become sloppy if membership is not controlled carefully, because adding someone to a group can silently grant many entitlements. Group sprawl can also occur, where too many groups are created, overlapping groups emerge, and nobody remembers what each group actually grants. When groups are poorly governed, they become a hidden layer of risk because access decisions become hard to explain and hard to audit. To make authorization safer, groups should have clear purposes, clear owners, and clear membership rules, so that group membership becomes a deliberate and accountable decision rather than an easy workaround. Roles take the idea of grouping one step further by bundling entitlements into job function packages, which is why role-based access control, or BAC, is so common. A role is meant to represent what someone needs to do their job, and the role contains the entitlements required for that job. Assigning a user to a role then grants them those entitlements. The major security advantage is consistency, because roles create a predictable baseline for access. The operational advantage is efficiency, because onboarding and job changes can be handled by role assignment rather than by a long list of manual permission changes. The risk is that roles can become overly broad if they are designed lazily or if they accumulate extra permissions over time. Role accumulation often happens because a temporary need becomes permanent or because roles are used to solve exceptions quickly without cleaning them up later. Safer authorization requires treating roles as curated bundles with governance, not as catch-all containers. When roles are clean, authorization decisions become easier to reason about and easier to review. Entitlements, groups, and roles are different levels of abstraction, but they are connected, and the connection is what makes authorization both powerful and dangerous. Entitlements are the actual permissions. Groups are membership containers that can grant collections of entitlements, and roles are structured bundles of entitlements designed around job duties. In many environments, roles are implemented using groups, meaning role membership is technically represented by being in a group. This can blur vocabulary, but the security logic remains. The reason this matters is that authorization errors often occur at the abstraction layer rather than at the entitlement layer. Someone might add a user to a group thinking it is a small change, not realizing it grants a powerful role-like set of permissions. Or someone might create a new group for convenience and attach sensitive entitlements without realizing the impact on auditability. Beginners should learn to ask not only what access someone has, but how they got it, because the pathway reveals how the system can drift. If access is granted through layers of groups and nested roles, it may be difficult to detect overreach without structured review. A major reason authorization becomes unsafe is entitlement creep, which is the gradual accumulation of permissions beyond what is needed. Entitlement creep happens through normal operations. People take on extra tasks, teams collaborate temporarily, projects create special needs, and urgent problems cause temporary access grants. The problem is that temporary access rarely gets removed unless there is a discipline of cleanup. Over time, identities accumulate extra group memberships, extra roles, and extra entitlements, and those extras become the new normal. The environment then contains many accounts with broad access that no one consciously intended. Attackers love entitlement creep because it creates paths for lateral movement and privilege escalation once any account is compromised. Even without attackers, entitlement creep increases the risk of mistakes because people can accidentally access or modify things they should not. The most effective response is to assume creep will happen unless you actively manage against it, which is why access reviews are not optional in a safe authorization system. Access reviews are the process of validating that authorization assignments still match current needs, and they are one of the strongest ways to make authorization decisions safer over time. A review asks questions like who is in this group and why, who has this role and should they, and which entitlements are actually needed for this job. Reviews matter because organizations change faster than permission structures, and without review, permission structures become fossils of past projects and past roles. A review also creates accountability because it forces someone to confirm access rather than letting access persist by inertia. Good reviews are not vague. They focus on high-impact roles, sensitive entitlements, and groups that grant broad access. They also happen on a regular schedule, so drift is caught early. For beginners, a key lesson is that review is not about doubting people, because it is about correcting systems that naturally drift. Authorization safety depends on routinely bringing actual access back into alignment with intended access. Another concept that helps make authorization safer is understanding the difference between direct assignment and inherited access. Direct assignment is when a permission is granted explicitly to a user. Inherited access is when a user gains permissions through group membership, role assignment, or nested structures. Inheritance is efficient, but it can create opacity, meaning it becomes hard to see why someone has access. Opacity increases risk because it makes reviews harder and makes mistakes easier. For example, if a user is in a group, and that group is in another group, and that second group is tied to a role, the user might have entitlements that no one realizes they have. In these cases, you can remove one membership and change access widely, which can also cause operational disruption if dependencies are not understood. Safer authorization favors structures that are explainable because explainability supports both security and operations. When you can explain in plain language why someone has access, you are more likely to detect when that access no longer makes sense. A critical beginner misunderstanding is thinking authorization is mostly about giving people access so they can work, when authorization is also about preventing conflicts of interest and high-risk combinations of permissions. This is where separation of duties becomes important again, because some entitlements should not coexist in the same identity. For example, if one identity can both request and approve a sensitive action, or both create and audit critical changes, the system becomes vulnerable to fraud and abuse. Safer authorization includes designing roles and entitlements to avoid these dangerous combinations. It also includes detecting when individuals accumulate multiple roles that together create an unsafe combination, even if each role alone seems reasonable. This is not about mistrusting individuals. It is about recognizing that systems should prevent a single point of failure in authority. When authorization structures incorporate separation of duties, they create built-in checks that reduce the chance of silent misuse. Authorization decisions can also be made safer by incorporating context and risk signals, even when the underlying entitlements remain the same. For example, a user might have the entitlement to access sensitive data, but the system might require stronger verification or additional checks when access is attempted from an unusual context. This idea aligns with attribute-based access control, ABAC, where policies evaluate attributes and conditions. Even in role-based environments, context-aware checks can reduce risk by ensuring that high-impact actions occur only under safer conditions. The key is to treat authorization as a decision, not a static possession. The decision should consider what the user wants to do, what resource they are targeting, and what conditions are present. When risk is higher, the system should tighten requirements, such as requiring reauthentication or requiring additional approvals. This does not replace entitlements, but it makes entitlement use safer in the real world where context changes. From an exam perspective, many questions about authorization are really questions about recognizing where risk comes from and what control best addresses it. If a scenario describes users having excessive access because of role changes over time, the correct answer often involves access reviews, least privilege, and cleanup of group membership. If a scenario describes inconsistent access decisions made by resource owners, you might be dealing with discretionary permission issues and the need for centralized role structures. If a scenario describes a dangerous combination of permissions, the correct answer often points to separation of duties and role redesign rather than simply adding stronger authentication. If a scenario describes uncertainty about why access exists, the correct answer often points to improving governance, documentation, and review processes. The common pattern is that safer authorization is achieved through intentional structure and continuous validation. You do not fix authorization problems by buying more authentication methods alone, because the core issue is what the authenticated identity is allowed to do. By the end of this episode, you should be able to think about authorization as the system of decisions that grants and limits power through entitlements, groups, and roles, and you should understand why access reviews are the mechanism that keeps that system honest over time. Entitlements are the specific permissions. Groups are a scalable way to grant permissions through membership. Roles are curated bundles aligned to job duties. And reviews are the correction loop that prevents drift and creep from turning the environment into a permission swamp. Safer authorization is not just a technical setting. It is a disciplined design and governance practice that keeps access aligned with real needs, avoids dangerous permission combinations, and remains explainable and auditable. When you can reason about authorization this way, you are prepared to move into deeper security topics with a strong foundation, because so much of security comes down to deciding who can do what and making sure those decisions remain correct as everything around them changes.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.